All right, this is your Chapter 2, Section 5 presentation, and in this section, we're trying to answer the question, what conflicts characterize the drive for ratification of the U.S. Constitution? So essential question number 12 is, what conflicts characterize the drive for ratification of the U.S. Constitution? Remember that while the Constitutional Convention was going on down in Philadelphia, the Confederation Congress, or the Congress of the Confederation, continued to govern up in New York, the capital of the United States at the time. The day after the Constitution was signed, it was taken by the Secretary of the Constitutional Convention to New York City to the Congress of the Confederation. It was also taken with the resolution with the Constitution was a resolution calling on each state to call ratifying conventions. In order for this new Constitution to be ratified and replace the old Articles of Confederation, they needed 9 of the 13 states to consent. A letter from Washington also accompanied the Constitution. Remember, Washington was still revered. He was the general who won the Revolutionary War. And he said essentially that despite its flaws, it was imperative that the nation move forward with the Constitution. That it will meet the full and entire approbation of every state is not perhaps to be expected, but each state will doubtless consider that had her interests alone been consulted, the consequences might have been particularly disagreeable or injurious to others. That it is liable to as few exceptions as could reasonably have been expected, we hope and believe that it may promote the lasting welfare of that country so dear to all of us, and secure her freedom and happiness is our ardent wish. The Congress of the Confederation accepted the work of the Constitutional Convention and passed it along to the states. From the fall of 1787 to the summer of 1788, the Constitution was debated vigorously. Those who had qualms or fears regarding it feared a number of things. They feared that state politicians feared a strong central government would diminish their own power. Others feared that distant national government wouldn't be responsive to the people. Debt holders feared that the new government with new financial policy would put them in greater debt, and the public was leery, as always, of taxes. They also feared the massive changes that would come along in a general way with this new Constitution. Those in favor, the merchants, the lawyers, the bankers, the people represented by those in the Constitutional Convention, thought that the nation, quite frankly, couldn't continue on its current path. James Madison said ratification was a question of whether or not the Union shall or shall not be continued. And so it became a battle between two groups, the Federalists, who immediately coined themselves as the Federalists to avoid being called nationalists, which might have had a more negative tone. They were those who favored a stronger national government.
Olivia Tower-Borelli, please report to the main office. Olivia Tower-Borelli, please report to the main office.
Sorry for that. Those Federalists were those who favored a stronger national government and supported the proposed U.S. Constitution. Later, this group became the first U.S. political party. The Federalists, I already mentioned that. But they also nicknamed their opponents the Anti-Federalists to give them a negative tone from the beginning. The Anti-Federalists were those who favored a strong state government, a weak national government, and opposed ratification of the Constitution. They argued that they wanted to protect state governments from tyranny of an all too powerful national government. Both sides participated in mass meetings held at state legislatures to debate the pros and cons of the new government. These debates were published in newspapers, and soon opinion pieces started to appear following those. The most famous of those sets of opinion pieces were those written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, writing under the pseudonym Plubius. They wrote 85 essays. It actually included Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, as well as a few that were written jointly. These essays became known as the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a series of 85 political essays written by the three gentlemen I just spoke about in support of ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Today, the Federalist Papers are considered deep insight into the framers' intentions, but at the time they were too dry and scholarly to have much of an impact on the voters. The political language of the day was way more fervous, way more expressive than this language. They did highlight the reasons for the structure of the new government and its benefits, which is why it's so useful to us today. And they were the clearest articulation of the theories and philosophies at the heart of our Constitution. The Anti-Federalists responded with their own papers written under the names Brutus and Cato. Those names are the names of two famous Romans who were adamantly anti-tyranny, who fought harshly against tyranny in the Roman Empire. They offered a line-by-line critique of the Constitution. They said that a strong national government would render the states powerless, that the Articles, not the Constitution, created a true federal system, that the national government would tax the people heavily, that the Supreme Court would invalidate state laws, that the president would assume so much power that it would be untenable because he was the commander-in-chief of the army, that the national government would run roughshod over the liberties of the people. Instead, they offered their own proposals, additions or changes to the Constitution as offered. They said that the taxing power of Congress should be limited, that the executive should be curbed by a council to oversee the executive branch, that the military should be state militias, not a national force, that the Supreme Court should be limited to prevent it from reviewing and overturning the decisions of state courts. And number one, and probably their best argument, and the one that ultimately will be adopted, they offered that there should be a Bill of Rights to protect the liberties of the people. In Federalist number 10, the Federalists said voters wouldn't always elect enlightened statesmen. So the greatest threat that would exist in this form of government was the development of factions in the government. But the organization of the new government would minimize the effects of factions, that the national government would be too large to be controlled by a single faction, and that the state governments would be smaller and more responsive to local needs. And then in Federalist number 1, Madison said that separation of powers would prohibit any one branch from dominating the national government or violating the rights of citizens. Ratifying the Constitution. The voting took place between December 1787 and June of 1788. 3 states ratify almost immediately. Delaware is the first to ratify, followed closely by New Jersey. Both of these small states didn't want to give the large states time to rethink the equal representation in Senate. Pennsylvania was dominated by Federalists, and so it ratified quickly as well. Massachusetts assented, but they started to call for additional amendments for personal rights. New Hampshire cast the important 9th vote on June 21st, 1788. And while this marked the start of the new nation lacked the support of the 2 biggest states at the time, New York and Virginia. And this put the nation in peril. Maybe it wouldn't continue despite the fact that it met the requirements as set out in the new Constitution for ratification. So the nation remained in doubt. Both of these states called for a Bill of Rights. North Carolina and Rhode Island are also holdouts. North Carolina rejected the Constitution. They were the only ones to outright reject it because of the lack of anti-Federalist amendments, the Bill of Rights amendments.
Simmons, report to Mr. Saunders' office. Deontay Simmons, please report to Mr. Saunders' office.
North Carolina was the one state to actually reject the Constitution outright because it didn't include the anti-Federalist amendments. And additionally, they and Rhode Island had started coining their own currency, so they didn't feel good about the national government being able to do so now. But soon after, Congress submitted the Bill of Rights to the states for ratification, and everybody signed on with the exception of Rhode Island, who was the last holdout, until they finally joined in 1790 when their biggest city said that they were going to secede or leave Rhode Island if they didn't. The Bill of Rights is 10 of the 12 amendments sent to the states. They received 3/4 of the votes and were ratified in 1791. These amendments offered limitations on the national government's ability to interfere with a variety of personal liberties: freedom of speech, expression, press, religion, and assembly. It also provided safeguards for those accused of crimes. It also had some reactions to the experience of the colonists under British rule. For instance, the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment; the right to not have soldiers quartered in their private homes, the Third Amendment. It included the Ninth Amendment, which made clear that the enumerated rights, the rights listed in this Bill of Rights, were not inclusive, meaning they weren't the only rights. People possessed other rights as well. And then the 10th Amendment ensured what was assumed but never written and now was for sure. Which is that the power not given to the national government is reserved to the states. You can pause here to take a look at the differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists before moving on to the reiteration of the essential question. The essential question, again, was what conflicts characterize the drive for ratification of the U.S. Constitution?